The thermometer nailed to the cabin door frame read 84 degrees at sunrise, and Clemmie Graybeal had been hauling water for 20 minutes before the sun cleared the ridge. The pail was heavy. The rope handle had gone slick with her sweat before she'd made it halfway up from the creek. Her shoulders burned in the places where the calico had worn thin, and her boots left dark prints on the dust of the dooryard that dried almost as fast as she made them. Zeb, 10 years old, freckled across the bridge of his nose. The way his father had been was crouched beside the porch step, pouring the last of the morning's milk into a tin crock that already smelled wrong. He tilted the jug carefully the way Clemmie had taught him, but careful didn't matter in heat like this. Nothing careful mattered. The milk had turned before the boy had finished his first chore of the day. In the dry summer of the Cumberland foothills, dairy spoiled within 4 hours once the temperature climbed past 80. They had been losing 2/3 of the milk every morning since the heat had broken open, like a lid on a kettle 10 days ago, and Clemmie had stopped counting the loss in quarts. She counted it now in meals. 2/3 of the milk meant 2/3 of the butter. 2/3 of the butter meant 2/3 of the trade value at Ransom Felty's general store. And 2/3 of the trade value meant that the distance between Clemmie Graybeal and hunger had been cut by a number she could not afford to say out loud in front of her son. Zeb tipped the crock and watched the sour milk spill into the dirt at the base of the old elm. The white puddle soaked into the ground and vanished. He stared at the dark patch it left. Pa knew how to keep milk cool, didn't he, Mama? Clemmie set the pail down. It was the first time Zeb had mentioned Knox in 3 weeks. She had been waiting for it the way a person waits for a cough that won't come, knowing the silence is not health, but only the body holding something back. Your father said a lot of things I haven't finished understanding yet, she told him. She did not know, standing there in the dooryard with the heat already pressing against her face like a flat hand, how true that sentence was about to become. She heard the carriage before she saw it. 2 horses, well-shod, moving at a pace that said the driver was in no hurry and wanted you to know it. A surrey with the T folded down the black lacquer sides, catching the early light. The wheels cut clean lines through the dust of the road below the cabin, and the sound of the iron rims on the dry ruts carried up the slope with the kind of clarity that only comes in still hot air. Mr. Elbert Van Hook of Philadelphia held the reins in his left hand. His right hand rested on the seat rail beside him, and the gold chain of his pocket watch caught the sun each time the surrey rocked over a stone. He wore a black silk vest over a white shirt that had been pressed that morning by someone who was paid to press shirts, and his hat was the color of smoke, and his face beneath it was the face of a man who had learned long ago to look patient while he waited for people to do what he wanted. Beside him, in a plain dark coat that no longer fit him quite right across the shoulders, sat Clemmie's brother-in-law, Spurgeon Graybeal. Spurgeon was 38. He had Knox's jaw, but not Knox's eyes. Knox's eyes had been the kind that looked at you and made you feel like the only person standing in the room. Spurgeon's eyes looked at you and made you feel like he was already looking at whoever was standing behind you. The surrey stopped at the edge of the dooryard. Van Hook lifted his hat without dismounting. Mrs. Graybeal, he said, we come on a kindness this morning. He produced 2 folded papers from inside his coat and held them out together the way a man offers a child 2 pieces of bread, knowing the child must take both or neither. Clemmie did not step forward. She wiped her hands on the front of her calico and looked at the papers. Zeb, in the doorway behind her, took half a step back when he saw the seal on the second one. The first paper was a deed of conveyance for 40 acres of cliffland, the Upper Allow parcel that Knox's grandfather Arlie had passed to Clemmie by separate bequest. The price written at the bottom in Van Hook's own hand was $80 cash, paid on signing. The paper smelled like the inside of a leather valise, and the ink was a particular blue-black that lawyers used when they wanted something to look permanent. The second paper carried the seal of the Bledsoe County Circuit Clerk, a petition, filed 3 days prior, for guardianship of one Zeb Knox Graybeal, age 10 minor child of the late Knox, Robert Graybeal, deceased. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday, 11 days from this morning. It's a petition, Spurgeon said. He would not look at her directly. His voice was the voice of a man reciting something he had practiced on the ride over, and the words came out flat and careful, like stones laid in a row. For guardianship of Zeb, the hearing set for the second Tuesday, 11 days from today. Clemmie, listen, it's the heat. They say a widow on a cliff is no mother. The judge has to consider the boy's welfare. And there it was, the sentence she had been afraid of since the day they brought Knox home from the Holloway logging camp in the back of Amos Whitfield's wagon, wrapped in a canvas tarp that was too short for him, his boots sticking out the end. A widow on a cliff is no mother. She looked at Spurgeon's face while he said it. His eyes flicked towards Zeb in the doorway, and for less than a second, something happened to his expression. A softening. The muscles around his mouth loosened, and the line between his brows went smooth. And in that fraction of a moment, Clemmie saw what she had suspected for months. Spurgeon did not hate his nephew. Spurgeon was not a cruel man. Spurgeon was a frightened man, and frightened men were worse than cruel ones, because cruelty could be argued with, but cowardice simply folded in whatever direction the wind pushed hardest, and the wind right now was blowing from Elbert Van Hook's direction. Then Spurgeon turned his face away and the softening was gone. "He's my son," Clemmie said quietly. "Sign the deed, Mrs. Graybeal." Van Hook's voice was patient, the way a school teacher is patient with a slow child. $80 is generous. The cliffland is worth nothing. The soil is too thin. The slope is too steep. No man could plow it. You will not see $80 again in this life. Take the boy to your brother-in-law's roof. Find a husband by Christmas. The Lord meant for women to be sheltered, Mrs. Graybeal, not to shelter themselves. Clemmie looked at Van Hook's hands on the reins. The left one trembled very slightly, the tremor of a man who had made a habit of whiskey before breakfast and no longer noticed the evidence it left in his fingers. On the ring finger of that hand, there was a pale indentation, the mark of a wedding band that had been removed a long time ago, a man who had once had a wife and no longer did. She noticed these things and stored them the way she stored everything, quietly and without comment, because Clemmie Graybeal had learned in the 2 years since Knox's death that the things other people didn't think you noticed were the only things worth noticing. She did not answer him. She set the pail down on the ground beside her right boot. The water inside it rocked once and went still. Behind her, Zeb's breathing had gone shallow. Van Hook smiled. 11 days, Mrs. Graybeal. Think on it." The carriage turned. The wheels cut twin lines in the dust of the dooryard, and the sound of the horse's hooves faded down the slope. And then there was only the heat and the stillness and the dead white sky pressing down on the roof of the cabin like a hand on a lid. Zeb came to stand beside her. He did not speak at first. He had learned in the years since his father's death to wait for his mother's silences to break on their own, the way a person learns to wait for a river to clear after a storm. You don't reach into muddy water. You wait. "Mama," he said at last, "what's a guardianship?" "It means another man would decide where you sleep, where you go to school, what name you carry." "He wants to take me away from you." She put her hand on the back of his neck. The skin there was hot, hot from the August sun, not from fever, not yet. In the lower hollow, 3 infants had already fallen sick from the heat. Mrs. Eder Bumgarner, who lived on the next farm over and traded butter with Clemmie, had told her yesterday that old Hollis Penn had lost his entire dairy in a single morning when the temperature climbed past 96. "Pa wouldn't have let them do that," Zeb said. Clemmie wanted to say, "Your father isn't here." She did not say it. Instead, she said, "Neither will I." The sentence was heavier than she expected. She had just made a promise she did not yet know how to keep. She felt the weight of it settle into her chest the way a stone settles into creek mud, and she knew that from this moment forward, every decision she made would either hold that promise up or let it sink. That afternoon, Clemmie walked down to Ransom Felty's general store to buy a pound of cut nails, a ball of tarred string, and a small whetstone. The heat outside was a living thing pressing against her skin, filling her lungs with air that felt like it had already been breathed by someone else. The road to town shimmered at the edges, and the dust she kicked up hung in the still air behind her like a veil that would not fall. She was standing at the counter counting out her coins when Icy Trivet came through the door. Icy Trivet was 50 years old. She was the widow of Judge Ellis Trivet, who had died of a stroke 8 years ago in his chambers in Pikeville, and she had worn black every day since, not out of grief, but out of authority. The black dress was not mourning, it was a uniform. Icy Trivet had been the most respected voice among the women of the valley for the better part of a decade, and she had earned that respect by being right about things more often than anyone was comfortable with, and by never letting anyone forget it. She saw Clemmie at the counter. She saw the nails and the string and the whetstone, and something shifted behind her eyes, some calculation that Clemmie could almost hear, like the sound of a latch turning in a quiet room. Icy waited until Clemmie had paid. Then she followed her outside and stood between Clemmie and the road. "Clemmie," she said, her voice was not unkind. That was the worst part. If Icy had been cruel, Clemmie could have dismissed her. But Icy Trivet spoke with the particular gentleness of a woman who believed truly and completely that she was saving you from yourself. "I know you love that boy, but loving a child is not the same as keeping a child. Loving a child means putting him in the safest place you can find. A cliff face is not a safe place for a 10-year-old boy." "The valley isn't safe either, Mrs. Trivet," Clemmie said. "3 children in the lower hollow are sick from the heat right now." Icy's chin lifted. Sick from heat can be treated. Falling off a cliff cannot. Clemmie held the nails and the string against her chest and looked at Icy's face. It was the face of a woman who had never been uncertain about anything in her life, and Clemmie understood in that moment that Icy was more dangerous than Van Hook. Van Hook wanted land. His motives were financial, and financial motives could be outmaneuvered. But Icy Trivet believed she was protecting Zeb. She believed it the way she believed in scripture and weather and the proper order of the world. And you cannot outmaneuver belief. You can only outlast it. Icy turned to 3 women standing near the hitching post. She spoke loudly enough for Clemmie to hear, loudly enough for everyone on the porch to hear, and her voice carried the quiet certainty of a church bell ringing across an empty field. A good mother would not drag her child up a cliff. The 3 women nodded. Clemmie saw them nod. She saw their faces, women she knew. Women she had traded eggs and fabric scraps with, women whose children had played with Zeb in the lower meadow. They nodded because Icy Trivet was nodding, and because nodding was easier than thinking, and because the heat had made everyone too tired to disagree with anything. Clemmie turned and walked away. She did not look back. Inside the store, Ransom Felty, 60 years old, white-haired with hands that still remembered the shape of every tool Knox Graybeal had ever bought from him, wrapped the nails and the string and the whetstone in brown paper. He walked to the door and watched Clemmie's back retreating up the road. Then he turned to Icy Trivet, who was still standing in the shade of the porch with the 3 nodding women. He did not say what he was thinking. Ransom Felty was not a man who said what he was thinking. But when Clemmie had been at the counter, he had placed the nails in her hand and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Knox would have wanted you to have these." It was not much. It was not an alliance or a declaration or a plan. It was an old man remembering a dead man, and it was the only help Clemmie would receive from anyone in the valley for the next 9 days. That evening, before Icy Trivet went home, she sat at her writing desk in the parlor of her house on Main Street and composed a letter to Judge Tully Crisp of the Knoxville Circuit Court. She wrote in a clear, upright hand, and she did not pause or cross out a single word because Icy Trivet did not make drafts. Dear Judge Crisp, the letter read, I write regarding the matter of the minor child Zeb Graybeal, whose mother, the widow Clemmie Graybeal, resides on a cliffside parcel in the upper Allow Creek drainage. I have spoken with Mrs. Graybeal personally. She possesses no plan for the child's welfare beyond her own stubbornness. Stubbornness is not a plan. I offer myself as a witness at the upcoming hearing should the court find my testimony of value. She sealed the letter and gave it to the Morning Post. It would reach the judge before the hearing. Clemmie did not know the letter existed. In the same week, Icy Trivet walked to 7 homes in the valley. She knocked on 7 doors. She sat in 7 kitchens and spoke to 7 women, and when she left each kitchen, she carried with her a signed statement. 5 women signed. The statement read, We women of Bledsoe County believe that the child Zeb Graybeal requires placement under a roof with a man at its head. 2 women refused to sign. One of them was Etter Bumgarner. Etter refused because she knew Clemmie because she had watched Clemmie raise Zeb through 2 winters alone without complaint, and because Etter Bumgarner was the kind of woman who judged people by what they did rather than by what other people said about them. But Etter also did not speak publicly against Ruth. She could not afford to. In the valley, Icy Trivet's opinion was currency, and Etter had too little currency already to spend it on a fight. That night, Clemmie put on her work boots and shook Zeb awake and told him to bring Knox's tool chest down from the loft. The big one, the one with the brass latches that Knox had oiled every spring. That one, Zeb asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. That one. He went. Clemmie stood in the main room of the cabin and listened to the sounds of her son's feet on the loft ladder, the scrape of the chest across the plank floor above the careful thump of each step as he brought it down. She looked at the room around her, the cook stove, the rope-strung bed, the table where Knox had sat every evening with the kerosene lamp burning beside his plate, reading aloud from his grandfather's journal, while Zeb ate cornbread and listened with his chin in his hands. $80. She ran the arithmetic in her head the way she ran it every night, the way a person runs their fingers over a wound to see if it is closed. At $5 a month for flour and salt and lamp oil, the way she had been living $80 would last 16 months. The 40 cliff acres and the standing hardwood on them were worth $400 at least. Van Hook knew this. Spurgeon knew this. The $80 offer was not generosity. It was a test to see how desperate she was. Zeb set the chest on the table. Clemmie lifted the lid. On top, where she had not put it, but Knox must have lay his journal. She opened it. She read by kerosene light until the lamp guttered and the flame shrank to a blue ring around the wick. The journal began the year Knox was 12. His grandfather Arlie had told him to start one, and Knox had kept it faithfully, the entries growing shorter as his life grew busier, the handwriting shifting from the careful loops of a boy to the fast slant of a man who had more to say than time to say it. The last entry was 3 lines. Clemmie had read them before in the weeks after Knox's death, when she had gone through his belongings with the slow mechanical attention of a woman who was not yet ready to grieve, but needed something to do with her hands. Zeb asked me every day when he can use the crosscut. Clemmie's hands smell like the basil she planted in the south bed. Going up to the Holloway camp Monday, back Friday. He had not come back Friday. He had not come back at all. She turned the pages. She had read this journal before, but she had read it the way a widow reads her husband's words, looking for him between the lines, looking for the sound of his voice in the shape of his letters. She had not read it for information. She had not read it for instructions. Now she read it for instructions. Near the end of the journal, between a page about fence repair and a page about the price of lumber in Pikeville, she found a folded brown square. Paper soft as cloth from age, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. She unfolded it on the table and held the lamp close. A map, drawn in Arlie Graybeal's hand, dated only built spring of 34, abandoned for the lower place 53. The scale was wrong, the north arrow pointed west, but the landmark was unmistakable. A 15-foot waterfall on the upper branch of Alcove Creek, drawn with small vertical lines to show the falling water. And behind it, a symbol that Arlie had used for a natural alcove, a crude open mouth shape like the letter C laid on its back. Inside the mouth, a house symbol, two crossed lines for the chimney, a small notation in Arlie's cramped slanting script, vents through fissure overhead, draws like a forge. In the journal's margin, in Knox's own hand, copied down years later from what his grandfather had told him. Grandpa said the rock kept the milk cool through August, even in the dry summer of 54. Said the cliff was the family's true inheritance. The valley land was just where we farmed. There was another entry earlier in the journal that Clemmie had skimmed past before without understanding. Knox had written it when Zeb was 7. Today Zeb fixed the henhouse gate hinge by himself. Nobody asked him to. Saw the hinge was loose and got the hammer and drove a nail. Drove it wrong the first time, bent it, pulled it out, drove it again. Did not call for help. His right hand had a small blister on the palm that he hid behind his back when I asked. This boy will hold on to anything he builds. Clemmie closed the book. She put both palms flat on the table and pressed down until the grain of the wood dug into her skin. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried at Knox's funeral. She had not cried when the foreman from the Holloway camp came to the door with his hat in his hands and his face the color of old plaster. She had not cried when the preacher said ashes to ashes and Zeb had reached for her hand and she had felt his small fingers tighten around hers like a knot being tied. She cried now, not because Knox was dead. She had made her peace with that, or at least she had built a wall around it tall enough that she could live beside it without looking over the top every day. She cried because Knox had been talking to her for 13 years, and she had listened to him the way you listen to rain on a roof, hearing the sound without hearing the words, and now he was gone. And the words were here on this table, in this lamplight, and she understood them for the first time, and there was no one left to tell. She wiped her face with her sleeve before Zeb could wake and see. Then she turned back to the map. She studied it the way Knox would have studied it. She traced the line of the creek with her finger. She found the waterfall. She found the alcove behind it. She found the chimney symbol and the notation about the fissure and the word forge. And she thought about Arlie Graybeal, dead 40 years, who had built a cabin behind a waterfall in 1834 and then walked away from it and never gone back, and who had drawn this map and left it in a journal that his grandson would keep and his grandson's wife would find on a night when she needed it more than she needed anything else in the world. She had thought when Knox told her these things on winter nights with Zeb asleep on his lap and the fire burning low that he was being sentimental. She saw now that he had been giving her instructions she did not yet know she would need. At first light, she put on her work boots and her oldest blue calico and shook Zeb awake. "Where are we going, Mama?" "Up." They climbed the stone path together in the gray light before sunrise. 120 feet of laid mountain stone overgrown with moss and laurel, but still passable, set decades back by Arlie Graybeal's own hands. The path skirted the cliff base, ducked under a low limestone shelf where the rock was cool against Clemmie's shoulder as she bent beneath it and opened into a side draw, where the upper branch of a low creek poured 15 feet down a sandstone face into a clear, deep pool below. Behind the falling water, Clemmie saw it before she felt it. The alcove, 25 feet wide, 12 feet deep, completely dry. The water fell in front of it, not on it, a curtain of white and silver that caught the early light and threw it back in shifting patterns across the rock. Inside, the stone was the color of old honey weathered into shallow scallops by centuries of air moving across its surface, and the air against Clemmie's face was cold. She pressed her hand to her cheek to be sure. Cold. 20 degrees cooler at least than the dooryard she had left 10 minutes ago. The sweat on her forearms went cool and then cold, and the calico against her back, which had been damp since before sunrise, went stiff. Zeb set his palm flat against the back wall of the alcove. "Mama, it's cold." She looked up. In the smoke-blackened, high corner of the alcove, she could see where the original chimney had vented through a natural crack in the stone. She looked down. The pool below the falls was deep enough for a boy to swim in clear to the sandy bottom, fed by water that came from somewhere inside the mountain where the sun had never reached. She knew the risks. The path could be treacherous in winter ice. A loose stone from above could fall. If the chimney crack were blocked or the wind pushed wrong, a cabin would fill with smoke. If the water table shifted, the alcove could flood. She had lain awake many nights since Knox's death, weighing risks like these against worse risks. She would weigh these too before she put her son under any roof of her making. Clemmie did not cry. She had already cried once last night, and Clemmie Graybeal was not a woman who repeated herself. But she sat down on the cold stone floor of the alcove, and she did not stand up for 3 minutes. Zeb sat beside her, and without a word, he placed his hand on her knee. It was the same gesture Knox used to make when Clemmie needed time at a quiet hand, no pressure, just presence. Zeb did not know he was doing what his father had done. Clemmie knew. That afternoon back in the valley, she stopped at Ransom Felty's store one more time. While Eder Bumgarner was paying for 10 pounds of cornmeal at the counter, Clemmie heard Albert Van Hook's voice from the back of the store. He was laughing. The laugh was small and precise, the way a man laughs when he has already won and is simply waiting for the other person to realize it. "The widow Graybeal will sign by week's end," he said. "The heat will break her. There's nothing on that cliff but rocks and brambles." Spurgeon laughed beside him. A smaller laugh, thinner, the laugh of a man borrowing someone else's confidence because he had none of his own. Clemmie did not turn around. She paid for her purchase. She walked out into the heat. She walked up the stone path. She did not come back down into the valley for 9 days. Before she left, she gave her chickens to Eder Bumgarner in trade for a sack of cornmeal and a promise of milk delivery. Eder took the chickens without asking questions. She was that kind of neighbor. The next morning, the valley cabin stood empty. The door swung on its hinges in the hot wind. The cook fire was cold. The chickens were gone. Spurgeon Graybeal rode past the cabin 3 times that day. He dismounted, once walked to the door, pushed it open, and stood in the empty room, looking at the table where the kerosene lamp still sat. The wick burned down to nothing. He concluded what Clemmie had intended him to conclude. He rode back to the boarding house in town and told Van Hook she's gone. To her sisters in Knoxville, or further. Van Hook dabbed his forehead with a folded silk handkerchief and smiled. It was a small smile, exact the smile of a man who has spent his life buying things from people who cannot afford to keep them. "Then file the abandonment notice," he said. "The cliff is mine by month's end." And 20 miles above them, behind a curtain of falling water, in an alcove that smelled like wet stone and old honey, Clemmie Graybeal sat on the floor beside her sleeping son and opened Knox's tool chest and began to plan. Clemmie felled the first sudger on the afternoon of the day she disappeared from the valley, and the sound of the axe hitting dry wood echoed off the cliff face and came back to her a half-second later, like the mountain answering a question she had not yet finished asking. The tree had been standing dead for 3 years. A red cedar tall and straight, its bark peeled back in long strips that hung like old wallpaper, the heartwood beneath it, a clean pink-brown that smelled like pencil shavings and church pews. She had chosen it because it was the closest of the 4 dead cedars on her 40 acres, and because its trunk was straight enough to split into planks without wasting wood, and because she did not have time to be choosy. 2 hours with the crosscut saw, sweat through the calico, through the shift beneath it, through the skin beneath that, until she could feel the salt stinging in the cracks of her knuckles. Zeb dragged the cut limbs to the side of the path, his small hands gripping branches twice. His arms span his boots, skidding on the loose stone. By dark, she had the trunk bucked into 8-foot lengths, and Zeb had carried 4 of those down the path one at a time on a yoke she had made from an old plow harness, the wood balanced across his shoulders the way she had seen Knox carry fence rails in the autumn of the year before he died. He could carry about 15 pounds at his age, half the weight of a finished plank. She watched him walk each load down the path with his jaw set and his eyes on his feet, and she watched the way his right shoulder dipped lower than his left under the weight, and she made a decision. "That's enough for tonight," she said. "I can carry more, Mama." She crouched until her eyes were level with his. The last of the daylight was caught in the waterfall behind them, turning the spray into a curtain of gold and copper, and in that light his face was so much like Knox's that her chest tightened. "You can carry more," she said, "but I can't carry it if I have to watch you hurt any more than this." Zeb looked at her. He understood the first part of the sentence, the part about stopping. He did not yet understand the second part, the part about a mother's endurance having a limit, and the limit being located not in her own body, but in her child's pain. He would understand that when he was older. For now he set the yoke down and rubbed his shoulder and went to wash his face in the pool below the falls, and Clemmie watched him go and then picked up the axe and began splitting the next length alone in the dark. The foundation went down on the second day. The floor of the alcove was uneven. Sandstone rippled and tilted by the slow geology of centuries, and Clemmie spent the first 3 hours of daylight on her knees with the mason's trowel, scraping moss and loose grit out of the cracks where the foundation stones would sit. She laid flat sandstone slabs from the cliff base, wedging smaller chinking stones into the gaps, building up 12 inches of dry-laid stone foundation along the 14 by 10-foot footprint of the cabin. No mortar for the foundation. Mortar cracked. Dry stone breathed, shifted, settled, held. Zeb carried the smaller stones. She lifted the bigger ones. By sundown, her hands had the small white blisters along the heel of the palm that no farm wife escaped, and Zeb had a long scrape down his right shin where a stone had slipped from his grip and caught him on the way down. She dabbed the scrape with vinegar in the lantern light while he sat on the alcove floor with his legs stretched out in front of him, the amber glow of the kerosene lamp turning the blood on his shin into a dark line that looked worse than it was. "Mama," he said, "why are we doing all this when the man said you'd get money?" She set the vinegar rag down. $80 would last us a year and a third if we ate carefully. This cabin, if we build it well, will last you and your children. There's a difference between being paid and being kept. Being paid means somebody gives you something once, and then they own the thing they gave it for. Being kept means you make a place and the place keeps you back. He thought about this. He nodded slowly the way a boy nods when he cannot yet hold the full weight of what he has been told, but knows it matters enough to carry anyway. She tied the vinegar rag around his shin and went on to the next task. There was always a next task. The walls began rising on the third day. Cedar planks split with the froe, a tool that looked like a large blunt knife set at a right angle to its handle. Clemmie would set the froe edge along the grain of the cedar log, and Zeb would tap the back of it with the wooden mallet, and a long, clean plank would peel off the way, a strip of bark peels from a birch. Each plank was nailed to the corner post with 3 2.5-inch cut nails, the points clinched over on the inside so they would not pull loose. The corner posts were notched at 16-inch intervals where the cross pieces would meet. By the fourth day, 4 walls stood 8 feet high, 3 sides solid plank, the cedar still raw and pale, 1 side framed for the door, and the 2 glass sashes that Clemmie Graybeal had bought in Knoxville in the 1840s, wrapped in oilcloth in the burned homestead's root cellar, where Clemmie had found them 2 nights ago while Zeb slept. They had survived 50 years intact. She held them up to the light and saw the world through Arlie's glass, the waterfall bending and warping through the old panes, and she set them into the frames and nailed them tight and stepped back and looked at what she had made, and for the first time in 4 days she allowed herself to breathe without counting what came next. Then Eder Bumgarner came up the path and the breathing stopped. It was the morning of the 4th day. Eder appeared at the limestone shelf carrying a tin pail of milk in one hand and a cloth sack of cornmeal in the other, and the first thing Clemmie noticed was not the supplies but the woman's face. Eder Bumgarner was 52 years old, built like a fence post, with hands that could milk a cow in the dark, and a voice that carried across a hayfield without raising itself. She was not a woman whose face showed fear easily. Her face showed fear now. She set the milk and the cornmeal on the flat rock just inside the alcove, and stood there with her arms at her sides, and Clemmie knew before Eder spoke that something had changed. Van Hook came to the farm last night, Eder said. After supper, sat in the kitchen with Hollis and drank our coffee and talked for an hour about the weather and the price of corn. And then right before he stood up to leave, right at the door, he mentioned that he's been talking to the new buyer at the Pikeville store about our butter contract. The contract that pays for 1/3 of everything we eat between October and March. She paused. She looked at the 4 cedar walls standing in the alcove, at the glass windows, catching the spray light, at Zeb sitting on the foundation edge with his bare feet in a basin of cold spring water. He said, and I'm giving you his exact words because I've been hearing them in my head all night. He said, Mrs. Bumgarner, I am not telling you to stop selling milk to anyone. I am only observing that the butter contract would be much easier to negotiate if you were not climbing this particular cliff anymore. Clemmie looked at the milk pail on the rock. Then she looked at Eder. You brought them anyway, Clemmie said. This time, Eder said, I don't know if there'll be a next time. Hollis says if we lose the butter contract, we won't make it through the winter. He's not wrong, Clemmie. I've done the arithmetic. There was a long silence. The waterfall filled it the way a waterfall fills everything, with a sound that was not quite noise and not quite music, but something in between, a continuous murmur that made all other sounds seem temporary. There's something else, Eder said. Icy Trevette wrote a letter to the judge. I heard it through Hollis, who heard it from the clerk's wife. Icy told him you have no plan. She said your stubbornness is all you have. Clemmie looked at the 4 walls. She looked at the door frame she had notched and fitted that morning. She looked at the cedar planks she had split with her own hands from trees that grew on her own land. She looked at the glass sashes that Clemmie Graybeal had carried back from Knoxville on a wagon 60 years ago. Mrs. Trivett is right about 1/2 of it, Clemmie said. I have stubbornness, but she is wrong about the other half. She pointed at the walls. That is the plan. Etter looked at the cabin. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that it was the most astonishing thing she had seen a woman build alone in 30 years of living in the Cumberland foothills. She did not say it because Etter Bumgarner was a woman who saved her compliments for moments when they would do the most good, and this was not that moment. This was the moment for the truth. I can't come back up here, Clemmie, Etter said. Not with the milk. Not while Van Hook has his hand on my contract. I know. Etter stood a moment longer. Then she walked back down the path, and Clemmie listened to her footsteps fade. And when they were gone, she sat down on the foundation edge beside Zeb and put her face in her hands. Not crying, she had used her one cry, just sitting in the dark behind her own fingers, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over her. Etter was not an enemy. Etter was the last friend she had, and Van Hook had taken her without raising his voice or making a single threat that could be reported to a judge. He had simply mentioned a contract the way a man mentions the weather, and the mention had been enough. That afternoon, Clemmie sat Zeb down on the flat rock and opened Knox's journal beside him. His feet were in the cold water, and the spray from the falls drifted across them both in a fine mist that settled on the page and made the old ink bleed at the edges. Three things work together, Zeb, she said. Three things. First, the rock holds the cold. Put your hand on the wall again. He did. Stone this size 50 tons above our heads. Maybe more keeps the cold of last winter all the way through August. Deep stone in our county holds about 55 degrees year-round. That is why a root cellar works, but this is more rock than any cellar in the valley. She pointed at the falling curtain of water. Second, the water. When water falls and breaks into mist, it pulls heat out of the air. Your great-grandfather Arlie called it the air giving up its warmth to the water. On our cliff in this draw, it pulls 10 or 15 degrees of heat off the air right at the alcove mouth. She waited for him to absorb this. And third, cold air sinks. The cool air from the rock and the cool air from the water both settle here in the alcove. They do not blow away, they stay. They pool like water in a basin. Zeb thought about this for a long time. The waterfall fell 10 feet in front of him with a sound like a word being spoken over and over. So the cliff isn't useless, he said. The cliff was never useless. They just never thought to ask what the cliff could do. On the afternoon of the fifth day, the temperature in the valley reached 103 degrees. The air was so thick with heat that the ridgeline above the hollow wavered and bent like something seen through old glass. And down in the lower pastures, the cattle stood motionless in whatever shade they could find their sides, heaving their mouths open. Inside Clemmie's half-built cabin, 3 walls standing, no roof, yet no door, hung just the alcove rock pressing its ancient cold against everything it touched. The thermometer she had brought up from the valley cabin read 78. She held it up for Zeb to see. 25 degrees, she said. No roof, no door, and we are already cooler than your Uncle Spurgeon's house. She did not let herself smile, but Zeb did a quick flash of teeth and freckles, and then Clemmie did just a little, just the corner of her mouth turning up before she went back to splitting the next plank. That evening, while Zeb dug the beds for his terrace garden in the mist drift zone outside the alcove, 5 small terraces of stone-edged soil stepping down the slope, each one watered by the constant spray of the falls, he turned up something from the dirt of the third bed. A small knife. Rusted shut, the bone handle cracked, the blade snapped off an inch from the hilt. He cleaned it with his thumb and turned it over. On the handle, barely legible beneath the rust, 2 letters had been carved into the bone. A G. Clemmie Graybeal. He put it in his shirt pocket and did not mention it to Clemmie until after dark when they sat together on the porch in the cool spray and ate the last of Etter's cornmeal mixed with water and cooked on a flat stone over the fire. He held the knife out to her. She took it and turned it in the lamplight. "Your great-grandfather left this here," she said. "He knew someone would come back." She handed it back to him, and he put it in his pocket again, and neither of them said anything more about it. There are some things that do not need to be discussed. They only need to be carried. The shingle roof went on the 5th in 6 days. 300 shingles hand-cut from a 5th standing dead cedar, each one split with the froe and trimmed with the draw knife until the edges were clean. Clemmie laid them in overlapping courses with a 4-inch reveal, each shingle nailed with a single cut nail near its top, the next course covering the nails of the one below. The pitch was 10 on 12, steep enough to shed the mountain rains that came hard and fast in August, but low enough that Zeb, climbing up the cliff face at her direction, could pass shingles up to her on the roof without losing his footing on the stone. She would not let him climb where the drop on the other side was more than 4 feet. Where the drop was greater, she did the climbing. The chimney was the hardest piece. The natural fissure in the rock overhead, the one Arlie had used, was 11 feet above the hearth, 3 inches wide at its narrowest point, opening to the sky on the cliff top. A natural flue. Clemmie built up the hearth in dry-laid sandstone, mortared above the firebox with a sand and clay mix she dug from the creek bank, 3 parts sand to 1 part clay water, mixed by hand to a thick paste that smelled like the earth after rain. The chimney rose 4 feet of stonework above the hearth, then transitioned into the rock fissure itself, which carried the rest. On the evening of the 6th day, she lit the first fire. A small handful of cedar shavings, no more. The flame caught. She stood back. The smoke wavered for a moment. It always does. Then it drew straight up. Up 4 feet of stonework, up 11 feet of rock fissure, out into the August evening above the cliff. "It draws like a forge," she said softly. Zeb came to stand beside her. He had been planting the last of the watercress along the wettest seep of the second terrace, and his hands were black with soil and his knees were wet. "Will it work, Mama?" "It is working." "I mean, will all of it work? The cabin, the garden, the hearing?" She pulled him in against her side. He fit against her ribs the way he had fit there since he was small enough to carry, though now the top of his head reached her shoulder. And in 3 years he would be taller than her, and she would be pulling him down instead of pulling him in. "In our family in this summer on this cliff, yes, I think it will work. I am not promising for anyone else's family anywhere else. I am promising for ours." She read aloud from Knox's journal that night, a long entry near the middle written in Knox's careful hand where Arlie had told his grandson about the death of his first young wife. Gertie, 20 years old, taken by cholera in the autumn of the building year, the year the Alcove cabin was new. Arlie had finished the cabin alone that winter, working in silence, sleeping on the stone floor beside an unfinished hearth. "I built it because I had to live somewhere," the entry said. "I built it well because she would have wanted to see it." Clemmie closed the book. Zeb was already asleep against her shoulder, his breathing deep and even, his body heavy with the particular weight of a child who has worked past his strength and fallen asleep before he could decide to. "You would have known what to do with this place, Knox," she said to the cedar plank wall. The wall did not answer, but the fire in the hearth shifted and sent a curl of spark up the chimney, and outside the waterfall murmured in the dark, and those things were close enough. That same morning in the courthouse in Pikeville, Elbert Van Hook filed a sworn statement of abandonment against the Cliff parcel. The clerk hesitated. He was a young man, 26, with a wife and a new baby, and a deep reluctance to make enemies. "Sir," he said, "there's no public notice of departure on record. File it anyway. The widow has not been seen in the valley for 9 days." The clerk filed it. He did not know that the widow at that very hour was watching her son float on his back in a clear, deep mountain pool, the cold water beating on his eyelashes, while behind them a small cedar cabin sat dry inside 50 tons of stone, with a chimney drawing clean white smoke into the August sky. 12 miles to the south, Vestal Shelton was nailing wet burlap over his south-facing windows for the third time that week, trying to keep the inside of his cabin below 95 degrees. He had lost 4 ewes to heat strain 2 summers back, and the memory of their bodies lying in the pasture, their wool dark with sweat, had stayed with him the way certain memories do not, as pictures but as a weight in the chest that returned whenever the thermometer climbed past 90. He heard from Hollis Bumgarner that the widow Graybeal had vanished. He did not comment. Vestal Shelton was not a man who commented. But that evening, standing in his dooryard with the wet burlap drying on his hands, he looked up at the cliff face above the upper allow drainage, and he saw a thin line of white smoke rising from the rock. Smoke that rose straight the way smoke rises from a chimney that draws well. Nobody else in the valley noticed the smoke. Vestal did. He said nothing about it to anyone. The night of the 7th day brought the storm. A thunderhead built up over the eastern ridge by supper time, a wall of purple and black cloud that rose straight up into the sky like a fist being raised. By full dark, the wind was driving rain horizontal against the cliff face, and the waterfall, which had been falling straight and clean for 9 days, began to shear sideways in the gusts, throwing spray into the alcove in sheets. The porch went slick. The cabin door rattled on its hinges, and inside the chimney that had drawn clean smoke for 24 hours began to cough. Clemmie smelled it before she saw it, the sour, acrid smell of smoke that has nowhere to go. She looked up from the table where she had been cutting leather patches for Zeb's boots and saw the gray tongue of smoke rolling out of the hearth, slow and thick, curling across the ceiling of the cabin like a living thing looking for a way out. Zeb was sitting at the table across from her. He coughed. His eyes watered. Clemmie threw the door open. She slammed the damper closed. She grabbed Zeb by the shoulder and pushed him out onto the porch under the overhang into the cool spray. He stood there with his hands on his knees, coughing, while she went back inside and looked up at the ceiling where the smoke was pooling against the cedar planks like gray water filling a shallow pan. The wind was hitting the cliff at an angle that compressed the air column above the chimney crack. The natural draft, the one that had drawn like a forge for 2 days, was being shoved backward. The same fissure that carried smoke out was now pushing it in. She had thought about this. She had known it was a possibility. She had not solved it. And in 2 days, the judge was coming. If the judge came and the wind was wrong and the chimney smoked, Spurgeon would win. The petition would be granted. Zeb would be taken from her. Everything she had built, every plank she had split, every nail she had driven, every blister on her hands, and every scrape on her son's shins, all of it, would amount to nothing more than proof that icy trivet had been right. Stubbornness is not a plan. "Zeb," she said, "I need you to climb." He looked at her through the rain. He did not ask why. He did not ask where. He stood up straight, wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist, and waited. She went into the cabin and came back with 3 flat sandstone slabs she had been saving for the cooling shelf. She wrapped them in a length of tarred cord and tied the bundle tight. She took Zeb around the side of the alcove to the place where the cliff rose at a gentle slope, the backside of the formation, where the rock was terraced in natural steps. About 4 feet of climb hand and foothold easy, the kind of slope she had seen him scramble 100 times in the valley pasture chasing chickens that had gotten through the fence. At the top, she said, where the chimney crack opens to the sky, set these 3 stones in a stack angled like a tent, so that the wind hits the stones first, not the crack. Can you do that? Yes, Mama. He climbed. She stood directly below him, one hand up ready. The rain hit her face and ran down her neck and soaked through the calico until the fabric clung to her arms, and she could feel the cold of the stone through the soles of her boots. She watched his small shape move upward in the dark, watched his hands find the holds, watched his feet test each ledge before he committed his weight. He moved the way Knox had moved in the woods, deliberate, patient, trusting his body to do what his mind had already decided. He reached the top. She heard the scrape of stone on stone as he set the slabs. 3 scrapes, then silence. Then his voice small and clear above the wind. Done, Mama. He climbed back down. She caught him at the bottom and held him against her chest, and his body was shaking not from cold, but from the particular tremor that comes after a child has done something that frightened him and has decided not to say so. She held him longer than she needed to. He let her. They went back inside. She opened the damper. The smoke in the cabin thin swirled and then drew upward in a clean line. The fissure was pulling again. The stone tent on the cliff top was breaking the wind before it could reach the crack, and the draft freed from the pressure was doing what it had always been meant to do. Some people, Zeb, she said, need to make a place, not just take one. It was past midnight before either of them slept. Clemmie sat by the hearth watching the fire burn clean, listening to the wind outside lose its anger by degrees, and she thought about the morning and the day after the morning and the hearing that was now less than 48 hours away. She had a cabin, she had a chimney that drew. She had a roof that shed rain and walls that held wind, and a cooling shelf in the wet rock outside the door that would keep milk and butter longer than any icebox in the valley. But she did not have a witness. Etter could not come back. Icy had written to the judge. The valley women had signed their names. She had herself, she had Zeb, she had the cliff. It would have to be enough. Spurgeon Graybeal came up the path on the morning of the 8th day. He had stopped at Ransom Felty's store for tobacco the way he did every Tuesday, and Ransom, who had no quarrel with Spurgeon, but who had a long memory of Knox mentioned in passing that young Zeb Graybeal had bought half a pound of cut nails the week before. Ransom said it the way he said everything mildly without emphasis, the way a man mentions that it might rain later. But the information landed in Spurgeon's chest like a stone dropped into a well, and the silence that followed was the silence of a man listening to the stone fall. He paid for his tobacco. He rode out the upper Allow Creek Road. He tied his horse at the head of the stone path and walked. He saw the smoke first. Thin white smoke drawing straight up out of the cliff face, rising clean and vertical against the blue August sky. Smoke that behaved the way smoke behaves when it comes from a chimney that was built by someone who understood fire and stone and the movement of air through rock. He stopped and stared at it and felt something move in his stomach that was not hunger. He came around the limestone shelf and stopped again. The water was falling. Behind it, glowing through the curtain in the amber light of a kerosene lamp that burned even at mid-morning because the inside of the alcove was dim and cool, was a cabin. A small cedar cabin with plank walls and a shingled roof and 2 glass windows that caught the spread light and threw it back in patterns that moved across the rock face like something alive. Clemmie stood on the porch drinking from a tin cup. Her calico was clean, her hair was tied back, her boots were laced. She looked like a woman standing on the porch of a house she had always lived in. Zeb lay on his stomach on the alcove floor outside the cabin door, reading a book with his chin propped on his fists. By God, Spurgeon said. Clemmie had heard him coming. She had heard him before he cleared the limestone shelf. Sound carries strangely behind a waterfall, and a man's heavy boot on stone is unmistakable. And Spurgeon Graybeal walked the way all the Graybeal men walked, heel first, heavy, as if they were trying to convince the ground they were bigger than they were. She set the cup down on the porch rail and stepped through the water curtain into the bright outside. The sunlight hit her face and she squinted, and for a moment she stood there, dripping the water running off her calico, and she did not speak. "Spurgeon," she said, "you think this saves you?" His voice was louder than it needed to be, louder than the waterfall required. The loudness of a man who is frightened and does not want you to know it. A shack behind a stream. The judge will laugh you out of the courthouse. The hearing is in 3 days. We will see what the judge does. I'll have the petition amended. Unsafe habitation, child endangerment. You think a cabin under a falling cliff is fit for a boy? She did not answer him. She did not need to. The cabin answered for her. It stood behind her, solid plumb dry, with smoke drawing clean from its chimney and cold air pooling on its floor, and 2 windows glowing with the blue-green light of water and stone. It stood the way Knox's work had always stood, square and true, and built to last, and Spurgeon looked at it and saw in it everything he had tried to take and everything he had failed to understand. He turned and walked back down the path. And he was a smaller man at the bottom than he had been at the top, though neither of them would say so, not then and not ever. That afternoon, Spurgeon and Van Hook together filed an emergency amendment to the guardianship petition. Cliff dwelling unsafe, falling rock hazard, child endangerment. The hearing was accelerated to 2 days hence. Judge Tully Chris, 63 years old, sitting circuit out of Knoxville for 30 years, granted the amendment. But he added a note in his own hand at the bottom of the filing, written in the small, precise script of a man who had spent 3 decades separating truth from noise. Court reserves the right to inspect any premises material to the question of habitation. I.C. Trivette was in the courtroom when the amendment was filed. She sat in the second row, straight-backed hands, folded her black dress, buttoned to the collar despite the heat. She saw the judge write his note. She saw him set down his pen and look at the note for a long moment before he closed the file. And for the first time since she had written her letter, for the first time since she had walked to 7 kitchens and collected 5 signatures, Icy Trivett felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. She felt uncertain. She did not know what Clemmie had built on that cliff. She did not know what the judge would find when he climbed the path. She only knew that she had staked her reputation on the word of Elbert Van Hook, who had told her the cliff was worthless, and on the evidence of Spurgeon Graybeal, who had told her Clemmie had no plan. And now there was smoke rising from the cliff face and a note in the judge's hand, and the hearing was 2 days away, and Icy Trivett sat in the second row of the Bledsoe County Courthouse and folded her hands tighter and said nothing. 2 days. Clemmie had 2 days. And somewhere below her, a judge was sharpening his pencil, and a brother-in-law was rehearsing his arguments, and a woman in a black dress was wondering for the first time in her life whether she had been wrong. The morning of the inspection was 101 degrees in the valley by 10 o'clock, and the sky had turned the color of a bleached bone. There was no wind. The air sat on the valley floor like something solid, pressing down on rooftops and fence rails and the backs of men's necks with a weight that was not measured in pounds but in patience. In the lower hollow, Eder Bumgarner's youngest child had a fever of 104, and Eder was kneeling beside the cot with a wet cloth that dried warm within minutes of being wrung. Old Hollis Penn had buried $12 worth of spoiled dairy in his back garden that morning because there was nothing else to do with it, and the shovel had struck the earth with a dull sound that Hollis would remember for the rest of his life as the sound of money being put in the ground. 3 families along the creek had moved their bedding out into the orchard the night before because no roof in the valley held below 90 after dark. and the children had slept on blankets spread over grass that was brown and brittle and smelled like dust. Judge Tully Crisp climbed the stone path with the county clerk on his right and Spurgeon Graybeal's lawyer on his left and Elbert Van Hook's land agent 2 steps behind. The clerk was a young man who sweated easily and was sweating now through his collar and his cuffs and the band of his hat, and by the time they reached the limestone shelf, he had unbuttoned his coat and was carrying it over his arm. The lawyer, a man named Burl from Pikeville, who had taken the case because Van Hook paid well and because Burl had never climbed a cliff before and thought it might be interesting, had unbuttoned his vest. Van Hook's agent, a heavy man in his 40s with a red face and short breath, had stopped twice to lean against the rock and press his hand against his chest. Only the judge kept a steady pace. He was thin and dry and white-haired, and his boots were the old-kind leather soles, no rubber worn to the shape of his feet by 30 years of circuit roads that made this path look like a church aisle. He climbed the way a man climbs who has stopped thinking about climbing and simply moves upward because upward is where the work is. Behind all of them, uninvited but unhindered, came Icy Trivet. She had dressed in black despite the heat, and the fabric clung to her arms, and her collar was dark with sweat, and she did not slow down and she did not complain. She had come to see for herself. She had written a letter. She had collected signatures. She had staked her word on the claim that Clemmie Graybeal had no plan, and now she intended to stand inside whatever Clemmie had built and know with her own eyes and her own hands and her own skin whether she had been right or wrong. They came around the limestone shelf. They saw the waterfall. They saw behind the falling water the cabin. The judge stopped. He took off his hat. He looked at the cabin for a long moment, and then he looked at the waterfall, and then he looked at the cabin again. He did not put his hat back on. Clemmie stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing the blue calico washed and dried overnight on the warm stone. Her boots were laced. Her hair was tied back with a strip of leather. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she did not move forward, and she did not move back, and the only sound between them was the marble and the breathing of 5 people who had just climbed 400 feet in 101-degree heat and were now standing in air that was 30 degrees cooler and did not understand why. "Your Honor," she said, "Mrs. Graybeal, I would be obliged for a glass of water. It is unseasonable." She brought a tin cup. She had filled it from the pool above the falls, the upstream catch, where the water came down off the mountain through rock and root and had never been touched by livestock or soil or human hands. Clean cold, 55 degrees. The judge took it and drank it down in one long swallow, and when he lowered the cup, he exhaled the way a man exhales when he has been holding his breath for 3 weeks without knowing it. "Mrs. Graybeal," he said, "may I sit?" "Inside, Your Honor. It is cooler." He stepped through the water curtain. The clerk and the lawyer followed. Van Hook's agent stayed on the porch, leaning against the rail, his face the color of raw clay. Inside the cabin, on the cedar table beside the cast-iron cook stove that Clemmie had not lit because she had not needed to, the thermometer read 70 degrees. Outside in the valley, it was 101. Zeb was sitting in the cool blue light of the water curtain at the smaller window reading Knox's journal. He stood up when the judge came in. The judge laid a hand briefly on his head, the way an older man touches a child's head when he recognizes something in the child that he cannot name but does not want to forget. The cooling shelf in the wet rock niche outside the door held a tin crock of milk, a wedge of butter wrapped in cloth, and a small wheel of fresh cheese that Clemmie had pressed 2 days ago from the last of Etter's delivery. She cut a slice of butter, placed it on a piece of bread, and handed it to the judge. The butter was firm. It had not softened. It had not wept. It held the knife mark cleanly, the way butter holds a mark only when it has been stored below 60 degrees. The bread was Eder Baumgartner's, 2 days old, still soft because the cold of the rock niche had slowed the stalling, the way cold slows everything, not by stopping time, but by asking it to walk instead of run. The judge ate. He chewed slowly. He did not speak for nearly a minute. The clerk stood behind him with his pen already uncapped and his notebook open waiting. The lawyer Burl stood near the door with his vest unbuttoned and his hat in his hand, and an expression on his face that suggested he was beginning to understand that he had taken the wrong side of this case. Then the judge set the bread down and turned to Burl. "Counselor," he said. His voice was mild. It was the mildness of a man who does not need to raise his voice because the facts are doing the work for him. "Your petition argues that this child suffers improper habitation. I am sitting in a 70-degree room while my own chambers in the valley are above 90. Have you any case to make?" Burl opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He looked at the thermometer on the table and then at the water curtain shimmering in the window, and then at the boy sitting in the blue light with a book open on his lap and his bare feet crossed at the ankles, in an expression on his face that was not fear or defiance, but the quiet attention of a child who has been raised well and knows it. Burl closed his mouth. The clerk was already writing. Icy Trivet stepped through the water curtain. Nobody had invited her inside. The judge had not called her as a witness. She had come on her own authority the way she did everything, and she stood in the doorway with her black dress dripping and her hands at her sides and her face arranged in the particular expression of a woman who has come to deliver a verdict and finds that the verdict has already been delivered without her. She looked at the walls. Cedar plank tight jointed, no gaps. She looked at the floor, swept clean. She looked at the cooling shelf through the open door, the milk and the butter and the cheese sitting in the rock niche, the way provisions sit in a proper kitchen, orderly and cold and cared for. She looked at the cook stove, the table, the rope-strung bed in the corner with the blanket folded at its foot. She looked at the thermometer. 70 degrees. She looked down at her own hands. They were wet with sweat. The fabric of her sleeves was dark from wrist to elbow. She had walked a quarter-mile uphill in 101 degrees to prove that a widow had no plan, and now she was standing inside the plan, and the plan was 31 degrees cooler than anything Icy Trivet had built in her own 50 years of living. She looked at Clemmie. Clemmie looked back. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She did not say, "I told you so," or ask Icy how the letter to the judge had worked out, or mention the 5 signatures or the 7 kitchens. She simply stood there in her cabin on her cliff behind her waterfall and let the room speak. Icy turned and walked back out onto the porch. She sat down on the step, and for the first time in 8 years of wearing black and speaking with authority and being right about things, Icy Trivet had nothing to say. "Did we win, Mama?" Zeb asked from the window seat. "I think we did, Zeb. I think we did." The judge dismissed Van Hook's claim of abandonment. He dismissed Spurgeon's amended guardianship petition. He ordered Spurgeon publicly censured for a petition unsupported by inspection of facts. He stood. He put his hat back on. He walked out onto the porch into the cool spray and stood there for a moment looking out at the falls, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has spent 30 years on circuit and still occasionally finds something that surprises him. "Mrs. Graybeal," he said, "I have not been this comfortable in 3 weeks." He started down the stone path. Halfway down, he met the rest of the day coming up. Elbert Van Hook was climbing the path with Obi Justus slung across his shoulders. The young clerk was conscious, but only barely. His lips white, his shirt dark with sweat, his head rolling against Van Hook's back with each step. Behind them on horseback came Spurgeon Graybeal, and his face was a face Clemmie had never seen on him before, not the face of a man calculating or hedging or choosing the easier road, but the face of a man who has just watched something happen to someone he loves and cannot undo it. Behind Spurgeon on the horse sat his wife Cressy, holding their 7-month-old daughter, Una wrapped in a wet wool shawl that had already dried in the heat. The child's small hand hung loose over Cressy's arm. Her fingers were not moving. Her color was the gray-white of candle wax. The judge stopped on the path. The lawyer stopped. The clerk stopped. Nobody spoke. Van Hook lifted his face. His hat was gone. His vest was dark with sweat, and the gold pocket watch chain caught the light, but the watch had stopped, and his hands, the hands Clemmie had noticed on the first day for their tremor, were trembling now with something worse than habit. "Mrs. Graybeal," he said, "the boy needs cold water. The doctor in town is 2 hours on horseback, and his wife says he is already attending a family in the lower hollow." Spurgeon could not speak. His jaw was working, but nothing came out, and his eyes were on Una, on the small gray hand hanging over Cressy's arm. And whatever calculation had lived behind those eyes for the past 2 weeks had been replaced by something rawer and more honest, and Clemmie recognized it because she had felt it herself 2 years ago. On the afternoon, a man came to her door with a canvas tarp that was too short. Cressy could not speak either. She held Una against her chest, and her lips were moving, but no words came, and the wet shawl steamed in the valley air. And the child's breathing was fast and shallow, the breathing of a body that is running out of ways to cool itself. Clemmie stood on the porch above them. Zeb stood inside the cabin in the cool light, watching her through the doorway. He spoke very quietly. "Mama, they were going to take me." "I know. Are you going to help them?" She thought about it. She did not pretend to herself that she did not have to think about it. The man on the path below her had offered her $80 for land worth $400 and called her cliff worthless. The man on the horse had filed a petition that would have put her son under another woman's roof and another man's name. The woman in the black dress on the porch had walked to 7 houses and collected 5 signatures that said Clemmie Graybeal was not fit to be a mother. She thought about her grandmother, Flossie Ledbetter, dead 20 years, who had raised 6 children alone in the Smoky Mountain Hollows after her husband was killed in a mill accident, and who used to say when Clemmie was small enough to sit on her lap and listen, "Show them who you are, Clemmie, not who they made you." She had carried that sentence her whole life, the way Zeb carried the bone-handled knife in his pocket, not as a tool but as a compass. And right now, standing on the porch of a cabin she had built with her own hands in 8 days, looking down at a man holding a dying clerk and a woman holding a dying baby, the compass pointed in only one direction. "Yes, Zeb, I am." She came down off the porch. "Bring them up," she said, "both of them into the alcove." Van Hook laid Obie on the cedar plank floor inside the cabin on a blanket Clemmie folded twice. The young man's eyes were open but unfocused, and his skin, when Clemmie touched his forehead, was hot and dry. The dangerous kind of hot, the kind that means the body has stopped sweating because it has run out of water to sweat. She pulled the cooling shelf out from its rock niche, the shelving she and Zeb had built 3 days back, and laid Una on it, still in Cressy's wet shawl. She dipped a clean cloth in the upstream water and laid it across the child's forehead, and the cloth went from cold to warm in less than a minute, and she replaced it with another and another, working steadily, the way her grandmother had taught her to work with sick children, not fast, not slow, just constant. She gave Obie sips of cold spring water. Small sips 10 seconds apart, the way you give water to a man whose body has forgotten how to regulate itself. You do not pour. You do not hurry. You give the body one small instruction at a time, and you wait for it to remember. Within 10 minutes, Una's breathing slowed. The fast, shallow rhythm eased into something deeper, and the gray-white color in her cheeks began to shift first to a pale pink, then to something closer to the warm tone a 7-month-old child is supposed to have. Within 20 minutes, her color had come back. The hand that had hung loose over Cressy's arm was now curled against the wet shawl, the fingers opening and closing, reaching for something. Within 40 minutes, she opened her eyes. She looked up at the sandstone ceiling of the alcove, at the honey-colored rock and the amber lamplight, and the blue shimmer of the water curtain beyond the window. And she made the small huffing noise that babies make when the world has rearranged itself without their permission, and they are not sure yet whether to protest or accept. Obi sat up at the end of the hour. His lips had color again. His eyes were focused. He asked in a small, dry voice for a piece of bread. Clemmie gave him one with butter, and he ate it slowly, and the butter was cold, and he held it in his mouth a moment before he swallowed, tasting the temperature as much as the flavor. Cressy sat on the floor beside the cooling shelf and wept. She wept with one hand on her daughter's leg and the other pressed against her own mouth, and the sound she made was not the sound of grief, but the sound of a woman who has been holding her breath for 2 hours and has just been told she can stop. Spurgeon stood in the doorway. He had followed them up, had dismounted and tied the horse and walked through the water curtain, and now he stood in the doorframe with his shoulders touching both sides and his hands hanging at his sides, and he could not make himself come further in. He looked at the cabin, he looked at the walls his brother's wife had raised. He looked at the chimney his brother's wife had built. He looked at his nephew sitting beside Obi Justus, handing a cup of water to a stranger, with the steady, unhurried competence of a child who has been taught that helping people is not a decision but a reflex. Spurgeon thought, this boy does not need a guardian. This boy has a mother, and I tried to take her from him. He stepped inside. He sat down on the floor beside Cressy. He did not speak. He looked at Clemmie, and for the first time since Knox's funeral, he did not look away. Van Hook stood on the porch with his hat gone and his vest hanging open, and his pocket watch still stopped at the hour Obi had collapsed. He looked at the cedar planks. He looked at the chimney rising into the rock. He looked at the small 4x6 pane window that Clemmie Graybeal had bought in Knoxville half a century ago, and the light coming through it was the green-blue light of deep water, and it fell across his hands and made them look like the hands of a man who has been submerged and brought back up. "Mrs. Graybeal," he said. He had to say it twice. The first time no sound came. "I misjudged the mountain." She did not answer him. She was watching Una. The child was sleeping now, her breathing, even her small chest rising and falling beneath the wet wool shawl. In the cool air of the alcove, the shawl steamed faintly, a thin curl of vapor rising from the wool, the way morning mist rises off a pond. If the cabin had not stood, if Clemmie had taken the $80 16 days ago and gone down to her sister's house in Knoxville, the doctor in town would have arrived for Una about 90 minutes too late by Cressy's later telling. And Obi Justus, 22 years old, the eldest son of a Philadelphia widow whom Van Hook had promised to look after, would not have walked out of the boarding house room where they had been keeping him, because by the time anyone thought to bring him cold water, there would not have been enough left to bring back. The judge stayed 2 hours longer in the alcove than the law required of him. He sat at Clemmie's table and drank 2 more cups of cold water and ate another slice of bread with butter, and when he finally stood to leave, he was carrying a small jar of Clemmie's fresh butter wrapped in oilcloth. He paid her $1/4 for it. She tried to refuse. He made her take it. "Mrs. Graybeal," he said, standing at the head of the stone path with his hat in his hand and the waterfall murmuring behind him, "I will write your name in my circuit book under a heading of my own devising. The heading is Persons of Demonstrated Competence. It is not a long heading. There are 9 names on it in 30 years. He went down. Icy Trivet went down with the rest of them, walking slowly, her black dress still damp from the spray. At the bottom of the path she stopped and turned and looked up at the cliff face one last time. She could see the thin line of white smoke rising from the rock, straight and steady, the chimney drawing the way it had drawn since the evening Clemmie first lit the fire. Icy stood there for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to her horse and rode home without speaking to anyone. She did not apologize to Clemmie. She was not the kind of woman who apologized. But the following week, when a widow named Texie Dyson on the far side of the ridge was threatened by her dead sister's husband over a 40-acre timber parcel, Icy Trivet appeared at the courthouse and sat in the front row and told the judge that Texie Dyson was a woman of competence and character and that the timber parcel belonged to her and to no one else. She did not mention Clemmie's name. She did not need to. Clemmie heard about it through Eder weeks later, and she understood the way one woman understands another, not through words, but through the direction of the current. The heat broke 6 days later in a long, cool rain that came down off the eastern ridges and settled into the valley for 2 full days. The roads turned to mud. The creek rose. The cattle came out from under the trees and stood in the pastures with their faces lifted. Van Hook did not go back to Philadelphia. He stayed at the boarding house in town, and on the 3rd day after the rain, he sent Clemmie a folded note asking permission to call. She received him on the porch of the Alcove cabin. He sat in the chair she offered and held his hat on his knee and did not look comfortable because the chair was a chair Clemmie had built, and it was the right size for Clemmie and not the right size for a man in a silk vest. He paid her $40 cash for a signed statement that she had been treated kindly by him during the week of the heat wave and that he had withdrawn his offer for her cliff parcel of his own free will. He intended, he said, to publish the statement in the Pikeville paper. Clemmie signed the statement. The $40 was the most money she had held in her hand since Knox died. With it, she bought a milk goat and a young brown cow from Eder Bumgarner, and she named the cow Gertie after Clemmie Graybeal's first young wife, who had died of cholera in the autumn of 1834 and had never lived long enough to see any cabin he built, not the one behind the waterfall, and not the one in the valley, and not the one in the hollow where the Graybeal family had lived for 3 generations after that. Spurgeon Graybeal in the same week signed his 2/3 share of the Valley homestead into a written trust for Zeb's eventual inheritance. The signing was witnessed by Judge Crisp, the county clerk in Eder Bumgarner. Spurgeon sat at the table in the clerk's office and put his name on the paper without reading it twice, and when he was finished, he stood and pushed the chair back and walked toward the door. At the door he stopped. He did not turn around. He spoke over his shoulder the way a man speaks when he has something to say that he has been carrying for a long time and cannot carry any further. "My brother would have been proud of you," he said. Then he walked out. It was the longest sentence Spurgeon Graybeal ever spoke to Clemmie, and it was the last. They lived in the same county for 20 more years, and they nodded when they passed each other at Ransom Felty's store, and they did not speak again. There are wounds that heal without stitches, and there are relationships that survive without words, and the nod between Clemmie and Spurgeon was both of those things, a small gesture that held inside it everything that could not be said. Cressy came up the stone path the following Sunday with Una in her arms in a covered dish of pork pie. They sat in the alcove and ate it while the waterfall murmured, and Una crawled along the cool stone floor and laughed the surprised laugh of a baby discovering that the world contained a temperature she had not experienced before. 4 years on the small cedar cabin had held through 4 summers and 4 winters without structural failure. The roof shed rain, the chimney drew clean, the walls stood plumb, the cooling shelf every August stored Clemmie's dairy at 53 degrees through outside temperatures, that peaked at 98, and the women in the valley who had once signed a letter saying Clemmie was unfit had long since stopped signing anything Icy Trivet put in front of them. Eder Bumgarner, after that first dry summer, climbed the path and asked permission to learn the principle. Clemmie taught her. Eder built a small alcove cooler against a sandstone outcrop on her own farm, not behind a waterfall, just under a rock lip, and it saved most of her dairy through the heat wave that took the rest of the lower hollow. The butter contract with the Pikeville store was never mentioned again. 2 summers later, Vestal Shelton on the south slope built a stone-lined spring house on the same principle. He never lost another ewe to heat strain. When anyone asked him where he had learned it, he said only, "Ask Mrs. Graybeal." 3 words. For Vestal Shelton, that was a speech. Clemmie taught the principle to a half circle of valley women on a Sunday afternoon under the alcove overhang. Zeb 14 by then was the one who handed the thermometer around for them to pass and read. He stood beside his mother and listened to her speak, and the women listened too. And when she was finished, one of them, a woman named Veda Culpepper, who had lost 2 calves to heat the summer before, said, "Why didn't anyone tell us this before?" And Clemmie said, "Because no one asked the cliff." 12 years on, Zeb Graybeal was 22 years old and married to a quiet, capable young woman named Wilda Ledbetter from the next valley over. They had met at a church supper in Pikeville when Zeb was 19 and Wilda was 17, and what he had noticed first about her was not her face or her voice, but her hands, which were the hands of a woman who knew how to build things and did not need to talk about it. Zeb ran a small dairy from the Alcove cliff and a one-man sawmill on the lower flat that Spurgeon's trust had restored to him. He and Wilda lived in the Alcove cabin, still with their first child due in the spring. The original valley cabin was rented to a family of newly arrived Welsh farmers who paid Zeb in milled lumber and fresh bread, and the arrangement suited everyone, and the bread was good. Elbert Van Hook of Philadelphia died in the boarding house in Pikeville that winter. He had never gone home. In his small estate, alongside 3 suits and a gold pocket watch that had not kept time since August, in a leather valise full of land deeds that had never been filed, he left to Clemmie Graybeal of the upper Allow Creek cliff his personal Bible with a note written inside the front cover in a hand that trembled. "To the widow who taught me to read the land." Obie Eustace came back to Cumberland once in the autumn of the year Van Hook died. He was 34 now, taller than he had been at 22, steadier, a man who had survived something and wore the survival quietly. He brought with him a portrait photograph of Van Hook taken in a Philadelphia studio years earlier when Van Hook had been 25 years old. In the photograph, Van Hook was young and clean-shaven, and his eyes had a softness that Clemmie had never seen the living man. He stood with one hand on the back of a chair, and on his left ring finger he wore a wedding band. "He lost his wife young," Obie said, "before I knew him, before the land deals and the vest and the watch chain. She died in childbirth, and the child died with her, and after that he never went home because there was nobody at home to go to. He became what he became, but he was someone else first." Clemmie took the photograph and held it in the lamplight. She looked at the young man's face in the picture and tried to find in it the man who had stood in her dooryard and told her that God meant for women to be sheltered, and she could not find him, and she understood that this was the point. She placed the photograph inside Knox's journal between the page with Arley's map and the last page Knox had written. 3 men, 3 different relationships with the land. Arley, who had built on it, Knox, who had listened to it, Van Hook, who had tried to buy it, and the land had outlasted all of them and would outlast Clemmie too, and the waterfall would keep falling after every name in this story had been forgotten. Clemmie was 44. She still wore the blue calico on the porch in the long summer evenings, though the fabric was thinner now, and patched at the elbows, and the color had faded from the deep blue of cornflowers to the pale blue of winter sky. She sat in the chair she had built and drank water from the tin cup and watched the waterfall turn gold in the last light. And sometimes Zeb sat beside her, and sometimes Wilda sat beside her, and sometimes she sat alone. The phrase "reading the cliff" entered the speech of 4 counties along the Cumberland line. It meant looking at land that other people had dismissed and asking it the right question. Farmers used it, builders used it, a school teacher in Pikeville used it in a lesson about minerals, and a circuit preacher used it in a sermon about faith. And neither of them knew where the phrase had come from, because phrases, once they enter the common language, lose their authors the way rivers lose their springs. The other phrase that lived after her, the one Zeb said at her grave some 30 years on, was this: "A widow on a cliff is more mother than a widow in a courthouse." She had not said it as a saying. She had said it once on a hot August porch to a 10-year-old boy who had been afraid he would be taken from her. She had said it to comfort him and to steady herself, and because it was true, and because sometimes the truest things are the things you say only once and never think about again until someone else remembers them for you. Zeb stood at the grave on a morning in early spring with the dogwoods blooming white along the ridge and the waterfall murmuring below, and he reached into his shirt pocket and took out the small, bone-handled knife he had dug from the garden terrace when he was 10 years old. The rust had been cleaned away years ago, but the blade was still broken and the handle was still cracked, and the 2 letters carved into the bone, AG, were worn smooth by 30 years of being carried. He set it on the headstone beside a bunch of wild columbine he had picked on the way up. He looked at it there, the old knife on the new stone, and he thought about Arlie and Knox and Clemmie, 3 people who had each in their own way read the cliff and answered its question. Then he picked the knife back up and put it in his pocket. There are things a man sets down and picks back up again, not because he is unwilling to let go, but because the thing is not finished yet. The knife had work left to do. It had a grandson to meet, and a story to carry, and a pocket to ride in through whatever came next. The cabin still stood when the next century turned. The chimney still drew, the waterfall still fell, and somewhere out there tonight, in a county you have never visited, on a road you have never driven, a mother is lying awake trying to figure out how to keep her child under a roof when the men with papers come. She does not know yet what the cliff can do, but she will ask it, and the cliff, because it has been waiting, will answer.